There were lots of older gentlemen there, but there was one kind of young guy. His name was Athanasius. He was about 20 years old. The amazing thing to me about On the Incarnation is that he wrote it when he was probably about 18 or 19 years old. When I read it, I think, boy, I don't know if I could write anything like that now, let alone when I was 18 or 19. Same thing is true when you start reading some of the great sermons of some of the great pastors of our time. Spurgeon, I guess he was before our time, but Spurgeon's messages when he was 20 are incredible. And so Athanasius was this young gun here. Here's a picture of him when he was old. This is a Kodak moment. There he is. This actually says something along the lines of Athanasius against the world. We'll talk about Athanasius against the world in a moment. They sat for a group photo as well at the Council of Nicaea. This is Constantine here in the middle. He is a halo too. Poor scribe here doesn't get a halo. That's how I know he's a scribe. He didn't get a halo. But they're here, and they're here for one main reason. These bishops had all sent petitions to Constantine. Hey, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this. Hey, there's a problem here. And the very first thing he does at the council is he grabs all those scrolls, puts them together, and burns them. And he says, I don't care what you want. I'm here, and this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about whether or not Jesus is God. Again, I think that in my cynical mind, that he did it so that he could have a united empire under one God. And that was going to make it easier for him to govern and easier for him to work through the church for his own political purposes. Now, this brings up a question. Well, is the deity of Christ just a political ploy set up by Constantine? And we've been wrong for 1,700 years. He's using this as a political forum. What do you think about that?
Well, it could have been, but God's good came out of it.
Okay, so God can use the political process, can he? And he certainly, I believe, used it here. Because you have a guy, Athanasius, who's at this council, again, he's 20 to 25 years old. Nobody's necessarily really listening to him in public. He probably didn't even speak at the council. But he's written this piece on the Incarnation, and he's talking to people. Here's a guy who's really defending here the deity of Christ. He is somebody who later writes a lot of pieces on the Trinity. He will in 367, 363, one of those two. He will discuss in a letter to the churches, here are the 27 books that we should count as what we would call the New Testament. He says, here's the canon. He is put into exile 5 times during his life because of his belief in the deity of Christ. Because once Constantine leaves power, more and more people more emperors come along, and some of them don't agree that they believe Jesus was created, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But he is continually in exile and out of exile. People are trying to set him up for crimes. One day, he was brought to trial for chopping off somebody's hand and using it in a potion of some sort for witchcraft. They then just brought in the guy and, hey, how many hands does he have? He's got 2. And Athanasius is said to have asked the judge, where then is his 3rd hand? Because he was supposed to chop one off. Another time, his opponents took and kidnapped somebody and put him off into exile and said, oh, look, Athanasius killed this guy. Well, the agents and friends of Athanasius found where he was and brought him back to trial. I mean, people are always after Athanasius, and at one point it is said that his scribe comes to him and says, Athanasius, the whole world is against you. And Athanasius then supposedly says, well, then it's Athanasius against the world. And that type of stance of, okay, this is what is true. this is what the Bible teaches, is what I'm going to stand for. And this is the person that Athanasius is. The key to victory here in the Council of Nicaea is that only God can save us. This is what a lot of the people were discussing here, is that, okay, if Jesus dies on the cross, how is there atonement if Jesus isn't God? There are a group of people who believe that Jesus is God, and there are a group of people following a gentleman named Arius, okay? And Arius is the guy that says, hey, Jesus was the first thing created, and then he created everything else. So in John 1, where it says that through him all things are created, of course they were, because God created Jesus, and then Jesus created everything. In Colossians chapter 1, in verse 15, it says, Jesus is the firstborn of creation. Well, Arius and his friends believe that firstborn there means that Jesus was the first thing created. He was begotten. Now, begotten isn't the best translation in English. It's more, in the Greek, has the connotation of being unique. Also, firstborn in Colossians 1 is talking about being preeminent. For instance, in the house of Isaac, who is the firstborn? No, the house of Isaac.
Isaac.
Who's firstborn?
Esau.
Who had the birthright?
Jacob.
Jacob. So who is firstborn? Who had the preeminence? Jacob. So when Paul writes that Jesus is the firstborn, he's talking about he's the preeminent one. He is the image bearer of this family of humanity. And so this gentleman by the name of Arius is famous for burnouts in his muscle car. No, Arius is famous for making these little ditties. He's the pastor of the time, he's the bishop of the time, who kind of seeker-sensitive type of church. And he creates all these problems for the believers of Jesus being God because he makes up all these songs. In fact, one of the Eusebiuses, Eusebii, it seems as though most theologians in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries were named Eusebius or Gregory. But one of the Eusebii wrote that you go into a shoe shop and ask how much is a pair of shoes, and they will tell you there was a time when he was not. And we'll come to that in a minute, but there were all these things coming on where Arius' little ditties, there was a time when he was not, and he would set it to music and little songs, which isn't always bad because, as you know, Luther set his hymns to beer drinking songs, right? A Mighty Fortress is Our God, the tune was a beer drinking song in the 17th century, in the 16th century, actually 16th century. But he would say these things, and so people were just going around reciting things without knowing what they were saying. So Athanasius came up with a word that's not in the Bible. Homoousios. And homoousios means same nature. Okay, the same nature. And so he begins to talk to the bishops, because he's, like I said, he's not the guy that's going to speak at the council. He talks to some bishops, and he probably gets one of the higher bishops to tell Constantine, oh yeah, Jesus is homoousios. And Constantine says in the Council of Nicaea, Jesus is homoousios with the Father. Well, he's the same nature. In other words, he's God. Because what would happen is the people who believed in the deity, like Athanasius, would say something, and they would quote Scripture, and Arius and his followers would twist it and turn it. And so they felt as though this was the one way to catch them, was to make sure that Constantine said, by the way, he's using political means, right, to get the process of God into effect here. He gets the emperor to say homoousios, and the battle is won. But Arius was saying, this is the heresy defeated, is Arianism, and he said there once was when he was not. Okay, there once was when he was not. They don't necessarily want to say there was a time when he was not, but in other words, Jesus is created. there's a religion today that says the same thing about Jesus. Anybody know what it is? Jehovah's Witnesses, okay? The Jehovah's Witnesses will say there once was when he was not. They don't sing it or they don't know it. I mean, so when a Jehovah's Witness comes and talks, we defeated, we said that this was heresy 1,700 years ago. That Jesus isn't created. Because if he's created, then what's the problem? If Jesus is created, right? He can't save us because only God can save us. And so, the Arians will teach that Jesus is like God, but not God. He's 100% human, but he's only like God. He's not fully God. Alexander was the bishop of Alexandria, Egypt. No, there's no necessary connection between Alexander being the bishop of Alexandria and a few years after this. By the way, Arius gets kind of booted out as a heretic. He has to leave the church. A few years later, he gives some money or he does some things. He writes some letters. Constantine writes to Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, Egypt, and says, Arius is good to go. He's back in the church. And Alexander prays, God, it's either him or me. I'm not going to give this guy communion because they were taking communion every time there's a worship service. So I'm not giving this guy communion. And Athanasius was known for writing things that weren't necessarily all that nice about people either. But he wrote that Arius has this big, huge parade and comes to the church, and everybody's welcoming him back. And he gets out of his carriage, and he says, "Excuse me." And he goes to the bathroom, and Athanasius writes that he bursts asunder and dies, and that Alexander's prayer was answered. Either him or me, and Arius dies. Who else bursts asunder, by the way? Yeah. Who else burst asunder? That's famous for bursting asunder in the old King James language. Judas, yeah. So Athanasius pretty much says Arius and Judas are right on the same par with each other because Arius was denying the deity of Jesus Christ.
What is burst asunder?
Burst asunder would be that your bowels just fall out of you somehow. So, yeah. Some of me thinks of gremlin in the microwave. Some of me thinks of just everything just falling out the bottom. I don't know exactly, but that's certainly what happened. Judas probably fell out of after he hung himself, cut down. When he fell, his stomach was cut open and his guts burst out, and so somehow.
So is that what happened?
I don't know if Arius really had burst asunder or if he had some sort of illness, a heart attack, but certainly Athanasius wanted us to connect him with Judas. That was absolutely 100% what he wanted to do because he saw Arius as denying who Jesus really was, as being fully God.